Dorothy Williams opened her eyes to the sound of birds chirping outside her bedroom window. At 72 years old, she had learned to appreciate these quiet morning moments. The sunlight was streaming through her lace curtains, the same ones she and her late husband Robert had picked out together 40 years ago. Everything in this house held a memory, and Dorothy found comfort in that. She slowly sat up in bed, her joints reminding her of her age with small aches and pains. But Dorothy was grateful. Grateful to wake up another day, grateful for her health, and grateful for the routine that kept her going since Robert passed away 3 years ago. Dorothy made her way to the kitchen, her slippers making soft sounds, on the hardwood floor that Robert had installed himself back in 1985. The coffee maker was already set up from the night before. She always prepared it before going to bed, just like Robert used to do. It was one of those small habits that made her feel like he was still with her somehow. As the coffee brewed, Dorothy walked to her back door and stepped onto the small porch. Her garden was her pride and joy. Robert had always joked that she had magic hands because everything she touched seemed to grow beautifully. The tomatoes were coming along nicely, and her roses were in full bloom. She made a mental note to cut some for the kitchen table later. The neighborhood was waking up around her. She could hear Mrs. Peterson next door getting ready for work, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking. These familiar sounds made Dorothy smile. This was her world, small but full of life. Back inside, Dorothy poured her coffee into her favorite mug, the one with faded flowers that her daughter had given her years ago. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at the mail from yesterday. Bills, advertisements, and there it was, her monthly pension check. Dorothy held the envelope carefully. This check represented her independence. After Robert died, she had worried about money. Would she be able to keep the house? Would she have enough for groceries and medicine? But this pension check, along with Robert's Social Security benefits, meant she could stay in the home they had built together. She opened the envelope slowly and looked at the amount. It was the same as always, but she still felt a wave of relief every month when she saw it. This money would cover her groceries, her medicine, and help her save a little bit for emergencies. Dorothy had been banking at First National Bank for over 30 years. She and Robert had opened their first joint account there when they were newlyweds. Back then, the bank felt like family. The tellers knew their names, asked about their children, and treated them like they mattered. But things had changed over the years. Many of the old employees had retired and new younger people had taken their places. Dorothy noticed that these new employees seemed rushed, always looking at their computers instead of at their customers. Sometimes she felt like she was bothering them just by being there. Still, Dorothy believed in doing things the right way. She could have signed up for direct deposit like her daughter kept suggesting, but she liked going to the bank in person. It gave her a reason to get dressed up and go out into the world. Plus, she enjoyed the walk downtown and the chance to see other people. Dorothy finished her coffee and went to get ready. She chose her best navy blue coat, the one she wore to church on Sundays. It was important to her to look presentable when she went out. Her mother had always taught her that how you dressed showed respect for yourself and others. She brushed her gray hair carefully and put on the small pearl earrings Robert had given her for their 25th wedding anniversary. Looking in the mirror, she saw an older woman, but one who still had dignity and grace. Her brown eyes still held the same sparkle they had when she was young. Dorothy gathered her purse, made sure she had her identification and the pension check, and headed for the door. She always took the bus downtown. Even though she still had her driver's license, she felt more comfortable taking public transportation. The bus drivers were usually friendly, and she enjoyed watching the city go by through the windows. The bus stop was just 2 blocks from her house. As she walked, Dorothy noticed how the neighborhood had changed over the years. Some houses looked tired and needed repair, while others had been fixed up by new, younger families. Change was everywhere, but Dorothy had learned to accept it as part of life. At the bus stop, she sat on the bench and waited. A few other people were waiting too. A young woman with headphones, an older man reading a newspaper, and a mother with a small child. Dorothy smiled at the little boy, who hid behind his mother's leg but peeked out to look at her. When the bus arrived, Dorothy climbed the steps carefully, The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Mrs. Williams. How are you today?" "I'm doing well, thank you for asking," Dorothy replied, feeling grateful that at least some people still cared about courtesy and kindness. As the bus made its way downtown, Dorothy watched the familiar sights pass by. The old movie theater where she and Robert had their first date, the park where they used to take their children to play, the restaurant where they celebrated their anniversary every year. Each place held a piece of her history. Dorothy thought about the task ahead of her. It should be simple, just deposit the check and maybe check her account balance. But lately, these simple tasks had become more stressful. The bank employees seemed impatient with older customers, speaking too fast or acting like they were wasting their time. But Dorothy was determined not to let anyone make her feel small or unimportant. She had worked hard all her life, raised 3 children, and supported her husband through good times and bad. She deserved to be treated with respect, just like any other customer. As the bus pulled up to her stop downtown, Dorothy gathered her courage along with her purse. Today would be a good day. She would handle her banking business with dignity, just as she had been taught to do everything in life. The sun was shining, and Dorothy Williams was ready to face whatever came next. Dorothy stepped off the bus and walked the 2 blocks to First National Bank. The downtown area bustled with morning activity, people hurrying to work, shop owners opening their stores, and the familiar sounds of city life. Despite the changes over the years, Dorothy still felt a connection to this part of town, where she had conducted her business for decades. The bank building stood tall and imposing, with its marble columns and brass doors that had welcomed customers for generations. Dorothy remembered when this bank was the heart of the community, where neighbors would run into each other and catch up on local news while waiting in line. As she approached the entrance, Dorothy took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. She had every right to be here, just like any other customer. The heavy glass doors opened with a soft whoosh, and she stepped into the air-conditioned lobby. The inside of the bank had changed dramatically over the years. Where there used to be warm wood paneling and comfortable chairs, now everything was sleek and modern. Cold marble floors, bright fluorescent lights, and electronic screens displaying numbers and advertisements. The personal touch that Dorothy remembered was gone, replaced by efficiency and technology. Several customers were already waiting in line, most of them looking at their phones or checking their watches impatiently. Dorothy took her place behind, a businessman who was tapping his foot and muttering about being late for a meeting. She looked around and noticed that most of the customers were younger than her. A few middle-aged people, some young professionals, but she seemed to be the only elderly person there. This made her feel slightly out of place, but she pushed those thoughts away. She belonged here just as much as anyone else. When it was finally her turn, Dorothy approached the teller window with a polite smile. The young man behind the counter couldn't have been more than 25. His name tag read Tyler, and he was typing something on his computer while talking on a phone headset at the same time. Next, Tyler called out without looking up from his screen. Dorothy stepped forward and placed her pension check on the counter. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "I'd like to make a deposit, please." Tyler glanced at the check quickly, then looked at Dorothy with what seemed like annoyance. "Do you have your account number?" he asked, speaking unusually loud as if Dorothy might be hard of hearing. "Yes, of course," Dorothy replied, reaching into her purse for her account information. She had it written on a small piece of paper, just as she always did. Tyler sighed audibly as he waited, drumming his fingers on the counter. When Dorothy handed him the paper, he looked at it with obvious frustration. "Your handwriting is pretty hard to read," he said, still speaking louder than necessary. "Maybe next time you could print it more clearly." Dorothy felt a flush of embarrassment. Her handwriting had never been a problem before, and she had written the numbers carefully that morning. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "The numbers are 743. "Ma'am," Tyler interrupted, "I need you to speak up, and please just let me type this in myself." He turned to his computer and began pecking at the keys with 2 fingers, taking much longer than it should have. While Tyler worked, Dorothy noticed that he kept glancing at the line of customers behind her, as if her transaction was holding everyone up. This made her feel rushed and uncomfortable, even though she knew she wasn't doing anything wrong. After what felt like forever, Tyler looked back at her. "Okay, so you want to deposit this check, anything else?" "Yes, please," Dorothy said. "Could you tell me my current account balance?" Tyler's expression showed clear irritation. "Ma'am, you know you can check that online, right? Or at the ATM? Outside? It would be much faster for you." Dorothy felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I prefer to do my banking in person," she explained politely. "I've been a customer here for over 30 years. "Well, things change," Tyler muttered, but loud enough for Dorothy to hear. He turned back to his computer and clicked through several screens with exaggerated movements, as if checking her balance was a huge inconvenience. The woman behind Dorothy, in line, was now checking her phone and looking annoyed. Dorothy could feel the impatience of everyone around her, and it made her hands shake slightly as she waited. "Your balance is $4,237, Tyler said quickly, not making eye contact. "Will that be all?" Before Dorothy could respond, a supervisor appeared at Tyler's window. The woman, who appeared to be in her 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a crisp business suit, had been watching the interaction from across the lobby. "Is everything okay here?" the supervisor asked, but she was looking at Tyler, not at Dorothy. "This customer is asking for her balance," Tyler explained, as if Dorothy couldn't speak for herself. "I was explaining that she could use the ATM for that." The supervisor, whose name tag read Rebecca, turned to Dorothy with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ma'am, our ATMs are very user-friendly. They have large buttons and clear instructions. Many of our senior customers find them much more convenient than waiting in line." Dorothy felt something twist in her stomach. The way this woman was talking to her, like she was a child who needed simple explanations, was unlike anything she had experienced in all her years of banking here. "I understand," Dorothy said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I prefer to handle my banking with a person. Is that not allowed anymore?" Rebecca's smile became even more forced. "Of course it's allowed, but we try to encourage our customers to use the most efficient methods available. Perhaps you might be more comfortable at one of the smaller community banks. They often have more time for traditional banking methods." The words hit Dorothy like a slap. She had been a loyal customer here for over 30 years, through good times and bad, and now she was being told she might be more comfortable somewhere else. The message was clear. She was no longer welcome here. Other customers in line were now openly staring. Some looked sympathetic, but others seemed annoyed that Dorothy was taking up time. She felt exposed and humiliated, standing there in her best coat while being treated like she was somehow less important than everyone else. "I think I'll complete my transaction here, thank you," Dorothy said, finding strength in her voice that surprised even her. "I've been banking here since before either of you were born, and I have every right to be served with the same courtesy as any other customer." Tyler and Rebecca exchanged a look that Dorothy didn't miss. It was the kind of look that said they thought she was being difficult, that she didn't understand how modern banking worked. "Of course," Rebecca said in a tone that suggested anything but agreement. "Tyler will finish helping you." As Tyler processed her deposit with obvious reluctance, Dorothy stood there feeling smaller than she had in years. This wasn't just about banking. It was about respect, dignity, and being valued as a human being. She had worked hard all her life, paid her taxes, raised her children to be good citizens, and now she was being treated like she was somehow less worthy of basic courtesy. But Dorothy Williams had not lived 72 years to be intimidated by people who had forgotten what customer service meant. She would finish her business here today, but she would not accept being treated this way. Something needed to change, and she was beginning to think that change might have to start with her speaking up for herself. Behind her in line, unbeknownst to Dorothy, someone else had been watching this entire exchange with growing concern and increasing anger at what he was witnessing. Standing 3 people behind Dorothy in line was a man who had been quietly observing the entire exchange with growing discomfort. Mark Sinclair had come to the bank for a simple business transaction, wearing his usual casual clothes, dark jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He looked like any other customer, nothing flashy or attention-grabbing about his appearance. Mark had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to move through the world was to blend in, to be just another person going about his day. But what he was witnessing at the teller window was making it impossible for him to stay silent and invisible. He watched as the elderly woman in the navy coat stood there with such dignity despite being treated so poorly. Her posture was straight. Her voice was polite, and she was asking for nothing more than basic customer service. Yet the bank employees were treating her like she was somehow less important than other customers, like her business didn't matter. Mark had seen this kind of treatment before, and it always made his blood boil. His own grandmother had faced similar situations before she passed away. People talking down to her, acting like her age made her less capable or less deserving of respect. He had promised himself after her funeral that he would never stand by and watch when someone's dignity was being attacked. The young teller was now processing the woman's deposit with obvious reluctance, his body language screaming that he wanted this interaction to be over. The supervisor stood nearby with her arms crossed, clearly annoyed that this difficult customer was taking up so much time. Mark felt his jaw clench as he watched. This wasn't just poor customer service. This was discrimination, plain and simple. The woman had done nothing wrong except be elderly and prefer to handle her banking in person. For that, she was being made to feel unwelcome and unwanted. The businessman in front of Mark was getting impatient, checking his watch and muttering under his breath about slow service. The woman in front of him was scrolling through her phone, occasionally looking up to see if the line was moving. Everyone seemed more concerned about their own convenience than what was happening to the elderly customer at the window. But Mark couldn't take his eyes off the scene. The woman, he heard the teller call her Mrs. Williams, was handling the situation with such grace that it broke his heart. She shouldn't have to handle it at all. She shouldn't have to defend her right to be treated with basic human respect. When the supervisor suggested that Mrs. Williams might be more comfortable at a smaller bank, Mark felt something snap inside him. He had heard that kind of coded language before, polite words that carried an ugly message. What she was really saying was that Mrs. Williams didn't belong here, that her business wasn't valued. Mark looked around at the other customers in line. Surely someone else was seeing this. Surely someone else was as bothered by this treatment as he was, but everyone seemed focused on their own affairs, either looking at their phones or staring off into space, pretending not to notice what was happening. That's when Mark realized that if someone was going to speak up for Mrs. Williams, it was going to have to be him. He watched as Mrs. Williams found her voice and stood her ground, telling the bank employees that she had every right to be served with courtesy. Good for her, Mark thought. But he could see the strain on her face, the way her hands shook slightly as she spoke. She was fighting this battle alone, and it wasn't fair. The teller and supervisor exchanged another one of those looks, the kind that adults sometimes give each other when they think a child is being unreasonable. Except Mrs. Williams wasn't a child. She was a grown woman who deserved respect, not condescension. Mark made his decision. He stepped out of line and walked toward the teller window, his presence immediately noticeable due to his height and build. He moved with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from years of dealing with difficult situations, though most people had no idea where that confidence came from. "Excuse me," Mark said, his voice calm but carrying enough authority to make both Tyler and Rebecca look up immediately. "I couldn't help but notice the conversation happening here, and I have to say, I'm a little confused about what I'm seeing." Tyler looked nervous suddenly, probably wondering if this large, serious-looking man was going to cause trouble. Rebecca straightened her shoulders, clearly trying to maintain her professional composure. "Sir, we're helping this customer," Rebecca said with forced politeness. "If you could please return to your place in line, we'll be with you shortly." Mark didn't move. Instead, he looked directly at Mrs. Williams, giving her a small, encouraging nod, before turning back to the bank employees. "I've been standing in line for the past 10 minutes, and what I've witnessed is this lady being treated with disrespect and condescension that I honestly can't believe." The lobby had gone quiet. Other customers were now paying attention, some turning to see what was happening. Mrs. Williams looked up at Mark with surprise and gratitude in her eyes. Mrs. Williams here, Mark continued, has been nothing but polite and respectful. She's asked for simple banking services that any customer has a right to expect. And instead of receiving those services with courtesy, she's been talked down to, made to feel unwelcome, and essentially told she should take her business elsewhere. Tyler's face had gone red, and he was looking around as if hoping someone would rescue him from this situation. Rebecca's professional mask was slipping, revealing the frustration underneath. "Sir, I'm not sure what you think you witnessed," Rebecca began, "but we were simply trying to help this customer understand her options." "No," Mark interrupted, his voice still calm but firmer now. "What I witnessed was ageism. What I witnessed was discrimination. What I witnessed was two bank employees forgetting that every customer who walks through that door deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their age or how they choose to conduct their banking." Mrs. Williams was staring at Mark now, clearly moved that a stranger would stand up for her. Other customers in line were nodding in agreement, finally acknowledging what they had all seen but chosen to ignore. Mark continued, "Mrs. Williams mentioned that she's been a customer here for over 30 years. 30 years of loyalty, 30 years of business, and this is how you treat her? By suggesting she might be more comfortable somewhere else?" The bank lobby was completely silent now except for Mark's voice. Even the sounds from the street outside seemed muted. Everyone was listening, waiting to see what would happen next. "I think," Mark said, looking directly at Rebecca, "that you need to get your manager down here right now. Because what I just witnessed is not only unprofessional, it's potentially illegal discrimination based on age. And as a witness to this entire interaction, I'm prepared to make sure that gets documented properly." Rebecca's composure cracked completely. She knew that Mark was right, that what had happened here could not be easily explained away or justified. And with multiple witnesses now paying attention, the situation had become much more serious than a simple customer complaint. Mark turned to Mrs. Williams, his expression softening. "Ma'am, you don't have to accept being treated this way. You have rights as a customer, and more importantly, you have a right to be treated with dignity as a human being." For the first time in the entire interaction, Mrs. Williams smiled. Not because the situation was resolved, but because someone had seen her, really seen her, and had decided she was worth defending. In a world that often made elderly people feel invisible, this stranger had made her feel visible again. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice stronger now than it had been all morning. "Thank you for speaking up." Mark nodded. "We're not done here yet. Let's make sure you get the service you deserve." Rebecca's face had gone pale as she realized the gravity of the situation. The confident supervisor who had been so dismissive of Mrs. Williams just moments ago now looked like she wanted to disappear. She glanced around the lobby, noting how many customers were now watching and listening to every word. I'll get the branch manager," Rebecca stammered, her professional composure completely shattered. She hurried away from the teller window, leaving Tyler standing there looking like he wished the floor would swallow him up. Mark stayed right where he was, positioned protectively near Mrs. Williams. He could see that she was still shaken by the whole experience, but there was something different about her posture now. She stood a little taller, her chin raised with renewed dignity. Having someone stand up for her had reminded her of her own worth. "Are you okay?" Mark asked quietly, leaning down slightly so only she could hear. Mrs. Williams nodded, though her eyes were still bright with unshed tears. Not tears of sadness, but tears of gratitude and relief. "I can't thank you enough," she whispered. "I was starting to think maybe they were right. Maybe I didn't belong here anymore." "Don't you ever think that," Mark said firmly but gently. "You belong wherever you choose to do business. Your money is just as good as anyone else's, and your years of loyalty to this bank should count for something." Other customers in line had moved closer, no longer content to pretend they hadn't witnessed what happened. An older gentleman who had been standing near the back of the line approached them. "I saw the whole thing," he said to Mrs. Williams. "What they did to you was wrong, and I'm ashamed I didn't speak up sooner." He turned to Mark with respect in his eyes. "Thank you for having the courage to do what the rest of us should have done." A middle-aged woman nodded in agreement. "I've seen this kind of treatment before, and it's not right. These bank employees need to learn how to treat all customers with respect." The support from other customers seemed to give Mrs. Williams even more strength. She was no longer standing alone against dismissive bank employees. She had allies, people who recognized her dignity and worth. Tyler, meanwhile, was fidgeting nervously at his window, clearly unsure what to do next. Without his supervisor there to back him up, he seemed to realize how inappropriate his behavior had been. He kept glancing at Mrs. Williams and Mark, then looking away quickly when they noticed. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, Rebecca returned with a man in an expensive suit who was clearly the branch manager. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of serious expression that suggested he understood the gravity of the situation. "Good morning," the manager said, approaching Mrs. Williams directly and extending his hand. "I'm David Chen, the branch manager. I understand there's been some kind of misunderstanding, and I want to personally apologize and make sure we resolve this properly." Mark watched carefully as the manager spoke. Unlike his employees, Mr. Chen was treating Mrs. Williams with the respect she deserved from the beginning. He made eye contact with her, spoke to her directly rather than talking about her, and his tone was genuinely apologetic rather than condescending. "Mrs. Williams," Mr. Chen continued, "I've been told that you experienced poor service today, and I want you to know that what happened does not reflect the values of this bank or how we want to treat our valued customers." Mrs. Williams straightened her shoulders. The support she had received had given her the confidence to speak up for herself. "Mr. Chen, I've been banking here for over 30 years. I remember when this bank felt like family, when the employees knew their customers and treated everyone with kindness. Today I was made to feel like I was bothering your staff just by asking for basic service." "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Mr. Chen asked, and Mark could see that he was genuinely listening, not just going through the motions. Mrs. Williams took a breath and began to recount the experience. She spoke clearly and calmly, describing how Tyler had spoken to her loudly as if she were hard of hearing, how he had criticized her handwriting, and how he had acted like checking her account balance was a huge inconvenience. "And then," Mrs. Williams continued, her voice getting stronger, "your supervisor suggested that I might be more comfortable at a smaller bank, one better suited to my traditional banking methods. The message was clear. I was no longer welcome here." Mr. Chen's expression grew more serious with each detail. He glanced at Rebecca and Tyler, both of whom were looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Williams," he said when she finished, "what you experienced today was completely unacceptable. No customer, regardless of age or how they prefer to conduct their banking, should ever be made to feel unwelcome in our branch." Mark spoke up then. "Mr. Chen, I witnessed this entire interaction. As a customer in line, what happened here wasn't just poor customer service, it was discrimination based on age. Mrs. Williams was treated differently than other customers would have been, and that's not just wrong, it's illegal." The manager nodded gravely. "You're absolutely right, and I appreciate you speaking up. It takes courage to get involved when you see something wrong happening." Mr. Chen turned back to Mrs. Williams. "I want to personally handle your banking needs today, and I want to discuss what we can do to make sure this never happens again, not just to you, but to any of our customers. I just want to be treated with respect," Mrs. Williams said simply. "I want to feel welcome in the bank where I've done business for 3 decades. I want your employees to remember that older customers aren't a burden. We're people with the same rights as everyone else." "You're absolutely right," Mr. Chen agreed. "And I want you to know that Rebecca and Tyler will be attending mandatory training on customer service and age discrimination. What happened today will be documented in their employment files, and it will not happen again." Tyler looked relieved that he wasn't being fired on the spot, but also genuinely remorseful. "Mrs. Williams," he said quietly, "I want to apologize. I was wrong to treat you the way I did, and I'm sorry for making you feel unwelcome." Rebecca also offered an apology, though hers seemed more focused on avoiding further consequences than on genuine remorse. Still, it was something. Mr. Chen personally processed Mrs. Williams' deposit and provided her account balance with the courtesy and efficiency that should have been offered from the beginning. He also gave her his direct contact information and assured her that if she ever experienced poor service again, she should call him immediately. Mrs. Williams, Mr. Chen said as he finished her transaction, I hope you'll continue to bank with us. We value your loyalty and your business, and we want to earn back your trust. Mrs. Williams looked at the manager, then at Mark, then at the other customers who had offered their support. For the first time all morning, she felt truly heard and respected. I'll consider it, she said with dignity. But I want to see real changes, not just promises. You'll see changes, Mr. Chen assured her. Starting today. As Mrs. Williams prepared to leave, she turned to Mark one more time. I don't even know your name, she said, but you gave me back my voice today. You reminded me that I have worth, and that I don't have to accept being treated poorly. Mark smiled warmly. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, Mrs. Williams. I'm just glad I could help remind these folks of that. The other customers in line began to applaud, quietly at first, then more enthusiastically. They were applauding not just for Mrs. Williams' courage in standing up for herself, but for Mark's willingness to get involved when he saw injustice happening. Mrs. Williams walked toward the bank exit with her head held high, her transaction completed and her dignity restored. She had experienced something terrible today, but she had also experienced something wonderful. The power of having someone stand up for what's right, and the strength that comes from knowing you're not alone. Behind her, Mark watched her go, with satisfaction. He hadn't revealed who he was or used his fame to resolve the situation. He had simply acted as one human being, standing up for another, and that had been enough to make a difference. As Dorothy Williams walked through the heavy, glass doors of First National Bank, she felt like a different person than the one who had entered just an hour earlier. The morning sunlight seemed brighter somehow, and the familiar sounds of downtown life felt more welcoming. She had her completed banking transaction, but more importantly, she had something she thought she had lost: her sense of dignity and self-worth. Mark followed her outside, having completed his own business quickly after the manager personally ensured he received excellent service. He caught up with Dorothy as she paused on the sidewalk, seeming to take a moment to process everything that had just happened. Mrs. Williams, he called gently, not wanting to startle her. She turned around, and Mark could see that her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but these were tears of gratitude, not humiliation. I still can't believe what just happened in there, she said, shaking her head in amazement. For a while I was starting to think that maybe they were right. Maybe I was just some old woman who didn't understand how things work anymore. Don't you ever let anyone make you feel that way? Mark said earnestly. What happened in there had nothing to do with your age or your understanding of how things work. It had everything to do with people forgetting basic human decency. Dorothy studied his face, taking in his kind eyes and genuine expression. Why did you speak up for me? You don't even know me. Most people would have just minded their own business. Mark was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer. My grandmother used to tell me that we're all connected, that what happens to one of us affects all of us. She said that when you see someone being treated unfairly, you have two choices. You can turn away and pretend it's not your problem, or you can remember that it could be you, or someone you love, in that situation someday. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman, Dorothy said softly. She was, Mark replied. And she taught me that courage isn't about being the biggest or strongest person in the room. It's about speaking up when you see something wrong, even when it would be easier to stay quiet. They walked slowly together toward the bus stop, neither of them in a hurry. Dorothy found herself thinking about her late husband, Robert, and how proud he would have been to see her stand up for herself in there. But she also thought about this stranger who had risked nothing for her and gained nothing for himself by getting involved. You know, Dorothy said as they reached the bus stop. I've been going to that bank for over 30 years, and in all that time, I can't remember ever seeing customers stick up for each other the way people did today. Usually everyone just minds their own business. Maybe that's part of the problem, Mark suggested. Maybe if more people spoke up when they saw unfair treatment, there would be less of it happening. Dorothy nodded thoughtfully. I think you're right. I know I'll never stand by quietly again if I see someone being treated the way I was treated today. The bus was approaching in the distance, and Dorothy felt a small pang of sadness that this encounter was coming to an end. This stranger had given her such a gift, not just by defending her but by reminding her that there were still good people in the world who cared about doing the right thing. I don't even know your name, she said, realizing they had talked, all this time without proper introductions. Mark, he said simply, extending his hand. Mark Sinclair. Well, Mark Sinclair, Dorothy said, shaking his hand firmly. You've restored an old woman's faith in humanity today. I hope you know what a special thing that is. As the bus pulled up to the stop, Dorothy gathered her purse and prepared to board. But before she did, she turned back to Mark one more time. I want you to know that what you did today is going to ripple outward, she said. I'm going to tell my daughter about this, and my neighbors, and my friends at church. They're going to tell other people, and maybe, just maybe, some of them will remember your example the next time they see someone who needs an advocate. Mark smiled. I hope so, Mrs. Williams. I really hope so. Dorothy climbed the steps of the bus, greeting the same friendly driver who had brought her downtown that morning. As she took her seat by the window, she could see Mark still standing at the bus stop, watching to make sure she got on safely. As the bus pulled away, Dorothy reflected on the morning's events. She had started the day as she always did, with simple plans and modest expectations. She had no way of knowing that she would face such humiliation, but also such kindness. She had no way of knowing that a stranger would see her worth when others tried to diminish it. The familiar sights of her neighborhood came into view as the bus made its way through the city. But Dorothy saw everything differently now. She saw potential allies in the faces of strangers. She saw opportunities to speak up for others who might need support. She saw a community where people could take care of each other if they just had the courage to get involved. Back at the bank, the ripple effects of the morning's events were already beginning. Mr. Chen had called an emergency staff meeting to discuss what had happened and to make it clear that discriminatory treatment of any customer would not be tolerated. Tyler and Rebecca were enrolled in mandatory sensitivity training, and new protocols were put in place to ensure that all customers received respectful service, regardless of their age or preferred banking methods. Word of the incident spread among the bank employees not as gossip, but as a wake-up call. Many of them realized that they too had sometimes been impatient with elderly customers, had sometimes made assumptions about what older people could or couldn't understand. The story of Mrs. Williams and the stranger who stood up for her became a reminder that every customer who walked through their doors was someone's grandmother, someone's parent, someone who deserved to be treated with dignity. 3 weeks later, Dorothy returned to the bank to make another deposit. She was greeted warmly by Tyler, who had genuinely learned from the experience and now made an effort to provide excellent service to all customers. Mr. Chen stopped by to check on her personally, and she left the bank feeling valued and respected. But the most important change was in Dorothy herself. The experience had reminded her of her own strength and worth. She began volunteering at a local senior center, helping other elderly people navigate modern banking and technology. She started speaking up more in her community, advocating for better treatment of senior citizens and encouraging others to do the same. And sometimes when she told the story of that day at the bank, she would think about Mark Sinclair and wonder if he knew how much his simple act of kindness had changed her life. She would remember his words about courage, that it wasn't about being the biggest or strongest, but about speaking up when you see something wrong. Dorothy Williams had learned that day that she didn't have to face the world alone, that there were still people willing to stand up for what's right. But more importantly, she had learned that she could be one of those people too. The elderly woman who had walked into the bank feeling small and invisible had walked out knowing that her voice mattered, that her dignity was worth defending, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to accept being treated as less than you are. In a world that often makes older people feel forgotten, one stranger's willingness to speak up had reminded Dorothy Williams that she was seen, she was valued, and she was not alone. And that reminder would stay with her for the rest of her days, inspiring her to extend the same kindness to others whenever she had the chance.